Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today we are diving into three stories making headlines around the globe. US President Trump's next move with Iran, Venezuela's political power struggle, and Australia's bushfire battle. To give your take on these topics, really easy. You can tweet us at ajstream or leave a comment in a live YouTube chat. It is curated, don't be scared, be kind to each other, and you too could be in the stream. Tensions between the US and Iran have dominated the headlines since the start of the year. President Trump vowed powerful sanctions in response to Iran's targeted strikes on US assets. On Wednesday, Trump addressed the nation and the Iranian people. Kimberly Halkett reports.
The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it.
But missing from the president's speech, evidence that the U.S. killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was justified and necessary to prevent an imminent attack on Americans. It's evidence opposition Democrats are demanding from the Trump administration. Also absent, a clear strategy, something the administration has promised to provide in closed-door briefings on Wednesday to members of Congress, including top Republicans.
Joining us to discuss that debate in Congress, we have Kimberly Halkett. She's at the White House. She's Al Jazeera English's White House correspondent. And right here in the studio, Nagar Mortazavi. She's an Iranian-American journalist. Welcome, ladies. Good to have you here. I saw Kimberly, Nagar, reading a tweet today, and when Kimberly reads a tweet in front of the White House, something bad is about to happen. This is the tweet. Hope that all House Republicans will vote against crazy Nancy Pelosi's war powers resolution. Kimberly, why is this important? And then Nagar, I'll get you to weigh in as well.
Well, I don't know if you have that whole tweet up there in full frame, but
yeah,
what really struck me was the ending, Femi, where I believe it's presidential harassment, exclamation point, as I recall.
Yeah.
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's why this is a big problem. Congress is required, whenever there is military action being proposed by the White House, they're obligated to debate this. This is the check and balance that has been put in place by the founding fathers in the U.S. Constitution. So when the president says presidential harassment, when Congress is essentially doing its job, that is not only unusual, it's alarming. Because once again, this is a president who denies that he is behaving as an imperial president, but that's exactly what that tweet reveals there.
Nagar?
Well, I agree. I mean, it's just too hard to not see the timing of all of this. President Trump was just impeached. He's up for re-election. His popularity keeps going lower. And then, boom, comes the strike out of nowhere. And so far, the administration hasn't offered any evidence, at least to that the Democrats here, the critics, would be convinced about why this attack had to be so imminent. Basically, killing a foreign government's top official, which brought the U.S. to the brink of a military conflict with Iran. And this is a president who campaigned against endless wars. He said he's going to de-entangle the U.S. from the Middle East, but every indication seems like he's going in that direction. So why did he do that? Some of these tweets seem to be pointing to that as well.
And it's not just Democrats that are upset with the president. It is even some members of his own Republican Party that are upset. I mean, we saw some very prominent senators coming out. Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee of Utah is one of them, who said he was incensed by the briefing, that it was almost insulting his intelligence because they didn't deliver the intelligence. And, you know, we all remember, or a lot of us remember, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and the argument that was made there is that there were weapons of mass destruction. Congress was told all of this, only to find out later it was flawed, faulty intelligence. There were no weapons of mass destruction. So Congress and the American people, I would argue too, really don't have an appetite for being lied to a second time. So that's why I think there is so much frustration with this White House, because they feel like they are being lied to.
Nagar, let me share this with you. This is from MTT on Twitter. One major consequence of this attack is that every country affiliated with the United States is a target for revenge, and by large, the world. Do you see it as that broad a situation right now?
Well, definitely, at least in the region, we saw Iranians willing and capable to attack U.S. bases from their soil, doing it very publicly. This time there were no casualties, but this was definitely a warning. And then in the statement that came together with the IRGC, they specifically mentioned if any country in the region lets U.S. forces use their bases from that country to conduct attacks against Iran, Iranians are willing to attack that country as well, because we know U.S. bases are spread across the region and other countries. So basically, this was a warning that, but then at the same time, they didn't want to start a full-on war, it seems. It was a warning that we don't want war, but if you want to pull us into one, we're willing to fight it.
Kimberly, we're based in the US, and so over the last couple of days, people have been mentioning war. And ramping up to war. Where you're there at the White House and you're monitoring what's happening coming out of Congress, what are you seeing and what are you feeling? Is that the same experience where the politicians of the US are based?
It certainly felt like we were on the precipice for war when those strikes were coming down against those two bases that house the U.S. military in Iraq. I mean, we had, just to paint a picture here, we had the U.S. president in the Situation Room, the State Department secretary, the Department of Defense secretary, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They were awaiting a battle damage assessment because you have to remember the U.S. president said if even one American is killed, he's going to respond. But that call never came. But still, there is this feeling of tension. Now, the U.S. president did subsequently come out, say all is well. It appears that Iran is standing down. But those tensions remain. And very quickly, Femi, I think it's important to point out it's really a question of starting points, because this administration constantly points to Iran, its malign activity in the broader Middle East going back decades. But this administration, when Donald Trump came into office, he came out swinging. Very clearly, he said that he was essentially taking on Iran to confront and contain. Those were his policies, whether it's with the economic sanctions, whether it's with the heightened rhetoric, whether it's with the military posture. So from Iran's perspective, it certainly feels that in fact, the United States has been the aggressor, not the other way around, as we often hear from this administration.
So, Kimberly and Nagar, when the conversation is really flowing on YouTube, I'm going to show everybody where it is right now. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can then see yourself as you scroll through here. It is going so fast, I can't actually pick out individual stories and individual questions. So I'm just going to give you a moment to see that and witness that. And then I actually want to put this to you, because this is what Nagar Valley says. And she says that President Trump wants to get out. If Iran would back off for a few months, he would pull out. He promised he would pull out of Iraq, and his voters expect it. His numbers are up since impeachment. Kimberly, you go first. Iran, and then Nagar, you comment on that.
Well, there's no question that the U.S. president campaigned that he wanted to get out of these forever wars. But here's the problem in all of this. He is surrounded by some very hawkish individuals. Well, John Bolton, his national security advisor, no longer part of that team. But he, for example, was hired by the U.S. president. He's advocated for strikes on Iran. Who remains? The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who, when he was in the U.S. Congress, was very hawkish on Iran. So even if the U.S. president feels that perhaps it's best to pull out these troops, he's getting an awful lot of advice from people who supposedly have more foreign policy experience than he does, who are saying just the opposite.
You've been writing about this idea of like an exit ramp. How do we get out of this situation?
Well, I just want to add to what Kimberly was saying, that it might have been that President Trump wanted all of that and he was just given bad advice until he was impeached. But we have to remember now he's the president that was impeached, and he's also up for re-election. So maybe even something in his own mindset has changed. But then at the same time, I think the miscalculation of this specific move, the targeting of Qasem Soleimani, was that he was probably advised that he's going to be seen as a hero for killing a terrorist like al-Baghdadi, and that didn't happen. It backfired here in Washington, as Kimberly is saying, and it backfired massively in Iran with the millions of crowds that we saw. But then at the same time, the retaliation that we saw from the Iranians seems to be calculated and strategic. It was like a warning sign saying, we're capable, and we're willing to hit you. No casualties this time. It seems like it was designed to have no casualties, but then at the same time, trying to make the region feel unsafe for U.S. forces. So eventually they would have to leave Iraq, which was Iran's goal to begin with.
If you've been following this story on AlJazeera.com and on Al Jazeera, it's hard to know what might happen next. But Adrienne Vakani is a journalist, and she's going out there. She's prognosticating. This is what she is saying about Where are we going next with this particular crisis? Have a listen, have a look.
I think it's really hard to predict exactly what is going to happen next, and I think anyone who is saying otherwise is really overconfident in themselves, but I do think regardless of what happens, it's the people in the Middle East who are going to be facing the repercussions for this escalation in hostilities. It's going to be the Iranians, it's going to be the Iraqis, it's going to be everyone else in the region, and what other countries need to be doing right now is steering Trump away from this maximum pressure strategy that he has been pursuing on Iran, and that has gotten us to this exact point.
Nigar, a last thought from you about where will this story go next? We've spent so much time with you on the stream over the years talking about Iran.
I also want to talk about the domestic repercussions of this. We remember we saw massive anti-government protests in Iran, even in Iraq, against Iran's influence, and the grievances haven't gone anywhere. But now those protests, their demands, their grievances have taken a backseat in face of this foreign threat. So in a way, President Trump hasn't in any way helped the protesters. He's actually unified the country against himself and made Iranians rally around the flag, basically.
Kimberly, I know better than to ask you what might happen next as you're sitting outside of the White House, but I'm going to anyway. Be bold. Go there, Kimberly.
Well, I think one important point in all of this is while the U.S. has had very aggressive language towards Iran, they continue to also speak out of the other side of their mouth, saying, but we still have the door open to diplomacy. But here's the reality. Right now, we know that the UN, at the United Nations, the Security Council was meeting on Thursday, and there was one absentee person there, and that was the Iranian foreign minister. Why could he not attend that meeting? Because the United States didn't grant his visa. That is where that kind of diplomacy could take place. Those discussions for peace could take place. So they really are hollow words by the United States saying they're open to negotiating a new deal with Iran, even to limit its nuclear program, when they won't allow someone who could conceivably help to begin that discussion into the United States to have that conversation.
Sure. Kimberly, Nigar, thank you always for your analysis and for your reporting. Really appreciate it. We go from Washington to Caracas, Venezuela, where political crisis is bubbling over. Over the weekend, allies of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro orchestrated a takeover of the opposition-controlled Congress. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman has more.
The headline reads, Congress wakes to two speakers of the House. In a country which already has two men claiming the presidency, Venezuelans are understandably confused and frustrated.
As the saying goes, we're left as if we were lost in space.
On Sunday, National Guardsmen prevented opposition Majority Leader Juan Guaido and other deputies from entering Parliament to initiate the year's session, as the Constitution stipulates. In his place, the pro-government minority swore in as Speaker, a deputy recently expelled from his opposition party.
But that showdown you just watched there didn't end. For more on this political crisis, we're joined by Latin American editor for Al Jazeera English, Lucia Newman, who you were just watching there reporting. Lucia, it looked like chaos. How do you make sense of what is going on?
Well, that was just on Sunday. You should have seen it on Tuesday. It was even worse. Guaido, and accompanied by his 90 deputies, stormed the palace, as you like, the legislative palace in this case, and they managed to push their way back into the chamber as the other group, the guy you just saw swearing himself in, ran for his life with his other group of supporters. So it's been, there you have him. See, he looks like he's walking on top of people's heads, but basically he's pushing the National Guard and telling them that they have no right to stop him, that the military has no right to decide who enters and who doesn't enter a civilian organization, which is a parliament. And that's what's been going on. It's a standoff. It's confusing for our viewers and readers, but it's even more confusing for Venezuelans because their media is very much controlled by the government. They're getting one take on what's going on from President Maduro, from the government, and then the other side doesn't have really much of an ability to strike back. But people just don't know anymore who is really in charge. But they do. But what is true is that the chaos, the conflict has risen.
I love your transparency there, Lucia. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and you can say we have no idea right now, because that would be true reporting too. Let me just show you here, Hunter Nim. Maduro is democratically elected. Juan Guaido, on the other hand, is a self-proclaimed leader of Venezuela. Democracy is alive in Venezuela. That is a valid question to ask, point to make. Or is it? Lucia, what do you think?
Well, if it were true, yes. But the trouble is that Maduro was elected in an election in which his rivals weren't allowed to run and under conditions that in most democratic countries would be regarded as unacceptable.
Let me put this one to you as well. This one is from Josiah. Maduro is elected president. Why mind Venezuela? It is a growing democracy. They will also sort out their issues in due time. And this reminds me of last year when the international community and some particular high-profile members of the international community were supporting Juan Guaido. What happened in the past year, Lucia?
Yes, he has lost support. And certainly at the closer he seems to become and the more beholden he seems to become to his number one ally, which is the Trump administration, the more some people seem to have doubts about him. I think he's been trying to find his way, and when I say he, I mean the opposition. They do have differences amongst themselves. They've been bickering a lot too. But the long and short of it is that while he got off to a very, what you could say, a good start if you're on the side of the opposition, after the end of April, after the failed coup attempt, if you like, or uprising against the government, they tried to get the military to turn on Maduro. When that failed, people just said, that's it. We're back to square one again. We don't think that this opposition can do it. So I was speaking to people today. They're saying, you know, they're all a bunch of lizards swimming in the same pond. Our only choice is to turn to God. We'll have to turn to God now to save us.
I'm praying for you, Lucia. Thank you for reporting for us for the stream. We really appreciate it. Take care. From the political firestorm in Venezuela to Australia's real-life firestorm, more than 24 people and more than 1 billion animals have been killed as wildfires rage across the country. Flames have destroyed at least 2,000 homes and left over 12,000 square miles of scorched earth. Here's a look at how people are reacting to that news on social media, including celebrities who are using their star power to raise millions of dollars to fight the fires.
Hey there guys, as you're well aware, the bushfires in Australia have caused massive devastation. They continue to burn.
Joining us from Sydney to discuss the impact of the fires, Al Jazeera correspondent Jessica Washington. Jessica, good to have you. You've been documenting so much of what you've been reporting on online, and the stories are really coming to life through your reporting on social. Let me just look at your Twitter feed here. Dave spent 10 years collecting parts for his 1965 vintage combi van. He was defending homes on the south coast when it caught fire. The car was clearly so special to him, he said he couldn't even look at it. Dave, the van. I mean, that just tells you one individual story. How are you managing to capture what it is like with the Australian bushfires right now, Jessica? How are you doing that?
It really is a case of, I mean, there are so many different stories. You've obviously got the residents who've had their houses destroyed, but then you also have these stories of these firefighters who, worth reminding the audience that the people who are out keeping these communities safe are actually volunteers. So many of them haven't been able to work for weeks, some of them months, while they've been fighting these fires. They've had some sort of income coming in, but of course it's a big personal sacrifice. You hear the stories like Dave, who, you know, people are losing their own properties out trying to defend the rest of the community. And I guess the tragic thing is when it comes to these residents is it's not just the houses that have been destroyed. In some cases, we've been travelling along bushfire-affected areas. It's whole suburbs. It's pretty unbelievable to arrive at a suburb and you can just count the number of houses that are left on one hand. And I think that's something that many Australians have never seen before. We always have bushfires. That happens every year. But this season is different.
We looked at some of the images from social media and what was getting people engaged with Australia all over the world. One of the things that people are really connecting with are the animals, the wildlife. I'm going to show another one of your posts here. I've seen koala bears, I've seen kangaroos hugging people. This one is a baby possum on its own, pacing in front of the flames, you say here. Let me just scroll up so you actually can see this picture. So people are being asked to evacuate, get out of the way. What's happening to the animals, Jessica? Is there room for them to be safe too?
So there are rescue services that basically go to these bushfire-affected areas, trying to get as many of those animals to safety as possible. But the reality is that, you know, these fires are burning through their habitat. We've obviously seen that the koala images have been sort of circulating on social media, people rescuing these koalas, giving them water and that kind of thing. But, you know, it's other animals too. It's plants, and worth remembering that Australia has so many endemic species that if these species did go extinct, they don't live anywhere else. That would be sort of the end for them if they can't survive in Australia. The estimate from scientists was initially 500 million. Now they're saying that it's more likely sort of the 1 billion mark in terms of animals which have died during this crisis.
Let me share this thought from you from Graciela, who's on Twitter. Graciela says, stop manipulating the forests, the lands, and there will be no fires. Governments and producers will tell you that it is due to climate change, when actually it's the other way around. Climate change is a consequence of the abuse of the agricultural activities, among others. So that is basically saying, this is climate change. This is climate change in action, and this is why we're seeing so many bushfires, but it's because we didn't look after the land. What are you seeing? What are you hearing, Jessica?
Well, what we do know from the science is that Australia is in the grips of basically a relentless drought that has gone on for a very long period, and that's sort of basically across the country. So New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, pretty much widespread. And those drought conditions created the circumstances for this bushfire season to basically spiral. We know now that the bushfires have burned through an area that's actually larger than the size of South Korea. So that's to sort of put in context how huge these fires have been. And scientists say that that drought is very much linked to climate change. So the issue of climate change, the debate around that issue is really sort of heating up here. And it's something that politicians are now saying that it's something that they do need to look at. There is talk from the Prime Minister that there will be an inquiry once this crisis is over into how much climate change did sort of influence this crisis. But of course, we heard from the scientists before these fires began. We actually know that the fire chiefs around the country had contacted the Prime Minister. They tried to set up a meeting telling him that they anticipated just how bad this fire season would be, and that meeting never happened. So there is a lot of criticism on the Prime Minister, and even though now he is talking about exploring the link between climate change and these fires, there's no indication that the government is going to change its policies, going to try to become less reliant on fossil fuels. Australia as an economy is incredibly reliant on coal. So there are some big questions that will come once this fire crisis is over, and I guess once the immediate tragedy is over as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about your Prime Minister, Australia's Prime Minister, I should say. Headline here, Australian Prime Minister calls for more tourists despite raging bushfires. His judgment has been called into question more than once. This is Scott Morrison, by the way, about how engaged he was with the crisis. How is his popularity right now? What do Australians think of him?
Well, it's sort of an interesting question. To put this in perspective, Scott Morrison won the election pretty recently, and it was just a few months ago that no one expected him to win, according to sort of the people who were doing the polling, and then he did. He pulled off this miracle election win. Now we've got a situation where basically his judgment is being called into question. He is, as you've just said, calling for tourists to still come to Australia, saying that Australia is a great place to holiday, but the holiday itself is sort of a controversial point when we're talking about Scott Morrison. When this crisis was still going, when Australia was sort of navigating its way through these bushfires, state of emergency had been called. People were wondering, where's the Prime Minister? And it turned out that he was actually on holiday in Hawaii. Since returning from his holiday, he's sort of struggled to regain some of that momentum. Everything he does is sort of under this intense scrutiny. And, you know, he's been touring these bushfire-affected regions, speaking with firefighters, speaking with residents who've lost their homes. And there've just been a number of gaffes, basically. And he's been going to these regions and receiving a bit of a frosty welcome. Some residents actually swearing at the Prime Minister, telling him, you're not welcome here. So this popularity is definitely a question. And many people are sort of calling into question the Prime Minister's popularity.
Al Jazeera's Jessica Washington, thank you very much for getting us up to date with what's happening in Australia with the bushfires. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time at aljazeera.com. See you soon.